One, I think I know most of you, but Jeremy Martin here, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. Been a while, I think, since we've actually had a webinar, a virtual panel. So in some ways, it's good to be back in the virtual Zoom. But you'll notice we dropped the typical Zoom webinar format and are going instead with this kind of virtual roundtable approach for today's session. When John and Veronica and I were talking about how to present this report and share this in a webinar format, we decided to be more useful for if we could create and foster an interactive dialogue with those of you who are joining us today. And so we'll invite you. We'll invite you to pose questions once we're done with. We have about 10 slides just to go through some of the key findings, key elements of the report. But I think most of you are probably familiar with the raise hand function in Zoom. So let's use that and raise your hand, and then we'll organize the discussion and truly have for most of the hour after we're done with our formal remarks, a more of an interactive back and forth. As I mentioned, pleased to be joined here today by Veronica Irastorza, principal at the Brattle Group and co-founder of Voz Experta, a group in Mexico seeking gender equity, particularly with regards to energy events and panels. And so, Veronica, welcome. Good to see you. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And John Padilla, Managing Director at IPD Latin America. I think dialing in from where? Colombia today, John?
Yes, sir.
All right. Good to see you again.
Likewise.
And John and Veronica are the co-authors of this report. And truth be told, they did most of the work. I'll dispense with more formal presentations of their bios. I think most everyone here knows them. And by the way, in the report, there's some more details about each of the authors at the very end. So let me just share a little bit of the context about this report and sort of where we came at it. And the origin is that in August, we began a research project looking at the role of not just nearshoring, but the intersection, particularly of energy infrastructure and some of the key factors associated with the nearshoring phenomena. And it was aimed to be developed as a white paper that was presented or was ultimately presented in a panel at the North American Forum, which was convened in Monterrey, Mexico. And Veronica was on a panel and John was there as well. And so the origin of this report was a white paper that was circulated as part of the conversation discussions at the North American Forum. But I also wanted to share a couple pieces about how we developed this report, and then I'll hand it over to John and Veronica to share some of the key details. But one of the things we decided was we wanted to get more firsthand data from companies on the ground. So we created a survey for companies and firms with global footprints that operate in Mexico, because we really wanted to get from them, hear directly from those executives about the barriers and incentives related to nearshoring in Mexico and more broadly North America. So we were able to survey and query 32 representatives from a series of global companies and manufacturers. We conducted the survey in August and into early September. There were 6 questions. I'll share some of the key pieces of that, and also it's in the report. But I also want to take a moment to thank the AmCham in Mexico City and the Council of Global Companies also in Mexico, because they were instrumental in working with us on getting some of the feedback and direct firsthand info from those executives. And so beyond the first question, which focused on sort of background, company, and sector, we moved into a survey that got into questions around topics such as security, water, electricity, infrastructure other than water or electricity, logistics, and permitting. And if we could go to the first slide or the next slide, that will give us some information on the so what was effectively question 2, respondents were asked to rank their top 3 answers in terms of barriers. So the first way we focused was sort of on barriers to investment. And as I mentioned, there were 6 topics we asked them to focus on. 53% ranking of participants listed security as their primary concern, with electricity just under 40% average ranking as the principal concern. And then infrastructure other than water and electricity was a little bit below the question or the issue of electricity. And on the right-hand side, we our third question is the part of the survey was, again, asking the executives to rank their top 3 answers, but this time with regards to cost, the perceived cost related to nearshoring investment. And once again, security proved to be, for the respondents, the foremost concern, around 65% average ranking. But infrastructure other than electricity and water was also important, around 42%. And then permitting also proved to be something that the respondents highlighted and indicated was an important factor influencing added costs with regards to nearshoring. So next slide, please. In terms of the fourth question, we wanted to understand what we called the most compelling reasons for nearshoring. So what is, from these executives' perspective, really driving some of this activity and this phenomenon we're reading and hearing so much about? And we again asked to rank their top 3 reasons in order of importance for their company. And proximity to the U.S. market was far and away the dominant factor, with the average ranking just below 80%. So that was far and away the most compelling reason that respondents indicated. Established supply chains, with over half of the respondents' average ranking, also a very important, compelling reason. And then interestingly, what we could call the realpolitik aspect, the geopolitical considerations, was also noted in the top 3 in terms of what the respondents thought was an important piece of the puzzle and what's compelling them to pursue these investments and these nearshoring opportunities. The fifth question was, again, back looking at cost impacts on nearshoring. We had talked about permitting earlier in the survey, and that again became indicated as a very important cost element and a cost impact. The permitting process was ranked 62% average ranking is the top issue. Electricity related issues again came out as a top 3 concern, second, 33% average. But then also the sort of famous doing business kind of question, incorporation or registration processes, was also highlighted in the top 3 of these executives. So just to finalize the sort of background and context of the survey, then we'll move on to the next slide for our final piece here. So then, of course, we wanted to understand, with all of the cost impacts, all the compelling reasons, the proximity questions, the labor questions, will these executives, will these companies be pursuing new or increased nearshoring investments? And almost 60%, so about 58% said they do anticipate making meaningful new investments in the next 3 to 5 year time frame. Although about 29%, so just under 1/3, did mention and did respond that they do not foresee any new investments, which may reflect a stance of maintaining current operations without significant expansion. A much smaller percentage, 13%, was looking at perhaps reducing or departing through divestiture or joint venture. So that's the survey. And again, I wanted to set the stage with that at the outset here. It was extremely useful to gather this information, and I ran through those results really quickly. But what they did is gave us a wonderful foundation to get into then, okay, let's look at some of these pieces that we got firsthand responses and information from the executives and take a little deeper dive. And that's exactly what we did. So let me stop there and hand it over to John Padilla, who will get into some of the first more detailed aspects of our research in the paper. John?
All right, thank you. So yeah, if we go on to the next slide, as a starting point, what I'd like to say is that there's been a lot written about nearshoring, and I think just a lot of misnomers of what it is, what it isn't, et cetera. And I think that we strove to very much, take a look at this from. I always look at this much more from an agnostic perspective, given my finance background, of what are the facts? What's really driving what? And so that was the approach that we took, obviously with the energy piece. And I think some of the survey questions, were driven from a perspective of trying to understand what what companies are seeing, what they're experiencing. Obviously, they have their own drivers, and there's a whole slew of different, aspects that that ultimately drive decisions. But before we get into some of those, I think, challenges, I think it's important to kind of lay out just some of the basics. And some of this was included in the report if you had the opportunity to read it. But I mean, I think the dimension, the size of the prize here is very interesting. So for a number of years, oil and gas was absolutely the main driver in Mexico. And what you're seeing is you're seeing a pretty significant shift that that is happening. And nearshoring, I think, which started out under this administration, kind of from a more skeptical perspective, you've seen a true embracing of it on some level. Some of it was ideological in terms of north-south, but the economic impact that this has the potential to provide is just on size and scale. And I think, once again, from a macro perspective, the big question for Mexico is just how much will it really take advantage of the opportunity. There's going to be what I would call the automatic residual. And that's because nearshoring in Mexico is really being driven off of existing supply chains. And supply chains are incredibly complex in the global marketplace that we live in today. And so, any given widget, whether it's your laptop in front of you, or the internet connection and your telephone, et cetera, it's made up by just a tremendous number of components that come from a whole slew of different places. And so where Mexico is where it is benefiting today is off of those existing supply chains. And those existing supply chains are fundamentally housed in the automotive, aerospace, electronics, pharmaceutical, and medical device areas. And by and large is really driven off of automotive. So there was a big question even up to 6 months ago, is it happening? Is it not happening? It's happening. And but the question is to what scale? So obviously we had announcements like the Tesla Gigafactory, et cetera. But the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of investment that is taking place off of the back of a couple of key events. I mean, one was COVID, the impact that it had in terms on supply chains and ability to deliver, and then obviously the geopolitical dynamics that you have. So the reality is that Mexico is now the U.S.'s largest trading partner, something that I think a lot of times is lost in the shuffle of the Beltway in D.C. And Canada is number two, and those two are two neighbors now represent 31% of all trade in the U.S. And the potential for that to continue increasing is very high. And on top of that, now with this increased kind of nationalism that we see globally, regionalism that's taking place, we've off of the back of the US IRA and the CHIPS Act, Mexico has the potential to have tremendous more investment if it can get all of the kind of pieces right. So it's going to get some of it regardless. I think that's something that people need to understand. It's going to happen through almost inertia on some level. The only question is really, will it be able to capitalize in the way that it should be able to capitalize if it puts those pieces in place? So, where we're seeing investment, it's in all of those corridors. It's along the border, but principally it's Nuevo León, right? And I mean, Nuevo León is capturing something like 72% of all, nearshoring activity right now. You also have El Bajío, that is capturing probably the other biggest portion, and then you have Baja that's probably number 3. And so there's been a lot of talk, obviously, under the last few years of the Isthmus Corridor, and I think it's just we didn't go into a tremendous amount of detail on this in this report, but the Isthmus Corridor. There's been interest to create some type of economic passageway, that dates all the way back to the 1600s, right? So this is nothing new, and the logic of it is tremendously there, but it's going to take time, and you don't have. And remember, it all goes back to supply chains. So when people start talking about all these other things, it's supply chains. And this, you have to develop supply chains, and you have to create the variables that are going to really kind of create that. So the only thing I want to say, on that front is that the size and scale here is just massive, right? I mean, you have U.S.-Mexico trade that's reached $864 billion. That's $100 million of trade every hour. $100 million. I mean, the numbers are, I think, a lot of times very difficult to get your head around. And Mexico is the 7th largest car manufacturer, even though it doesn't produce its own. There's not a Mexican vehicle, and the Volcho, contrary to popular belief, is not Mexican. It is German, and it doesn't have a produced vehicle. Largest flat screen TVs, 6th largest electronics producer. So these are huge numbers. But the eye of the prize, and what I want to leave you with is that it's going to be the success will be driven off of the ability to attract new investment. That's so get things right for the existing supply chains, but then also be able to create the elements that will be able to attract new investment. And this is where the CHIPS Act comes into play. And it's why you have, the US actually now only holds about 12% of chip manufacturing, right? And that's down from 37% nearly 3 decades ago. And so this is what's driving that. And the question is can then Mexico attract that investment? Some of it's already here, some of that already exists, but with what's going on in Arizona, Texas, et cetera, that'll be the big question. And so we'll see where that kind of goes. So if we just go to the next slide, what I wanted to lay out was basically the challenges, because this is going to drive the first element of whether with the existing supply chains you can kind of figure things out. And so when you look at the infrastructure in Mexico, it is light years ahead of, quite honestly, the rest of Latin America on a large front. Yet it still has a long ways to go in terms of kind of being able to compete and be as efficient and effective as it can be. So, that's everything from, the highways, expansion of highways, ports. You have saturated ports in Manzanillo, not been able to kind of get the port off the ground in Baja. And, then, there's Lázaro Cárdenas, but that's further south. So then you're going to need to be able to create, additional infrastructure that helps on that front. Storage and what I would call redundancy is absolutely key. A lot of things, what you have in Mexico is that you don't have that kind of redundancy in the system. So if something goes down, that becomes a problem. And so for, very fluid supply chains, this becomes incredibly complicated. There's been a lot of discussion on water. I'm not going to go into it, but it's obviously a topic as it relates to northern Mexico. And then gas pipelines, infrastructure. Just the simple fact that in Mexico, the only storage that you really have technically is the LNG regasification terminals. We don't have dedicated gas storage in Mexico. Security is obviously a big issue, but I think that's where question number 5 was really, really interesting, because the perception is security is very significant. But when you take a look at the cost aspect of it, it's not necessarily, it's a concern, it's a real concern, but it's kind of coming out in the cost level of where people thought it was going to be. What they haven't, what they didn't anticipate very well is basically what the cost of permitting and all the other delays are. And that's a piece that I think is really interesting from the survey questions, you know, that we undertook. You know, there's been much more political and legal uncertainty in Mexico, and this becomes a big issue as it relates to the next administration. And so if you are in fact interested in creating economic activity and economic growth off of the back of nearshoring, if this becomes one of the new areas for growth, well, then you need to, you know, basically create a political, or I'm sorry, a legal framework and regulatory certainty that is going to kind of promote that. The good news is that Mexico, you know, for the first time has actually created incentives. And this is historic, and it really should, you know, be looked at in a pretty meaningful kind of way. So there's accelerated depreciation off of, you know, most of the existing supply chains, and then there is deductions that can be taken 25% for workforce training as it relates to technical and to scientific areas. That is very big, and what it tells me is that the government absolutely understands and appreciates that nearshoring is going to have a big the economic growth going forward, and they're going to need to promote that. So there's growing pains. The growing pains to me are all related to the border. And there are there's workforces in place right now, cross-border, bilateral, you know, efforts underway. There's still a lot of work to be done. Obviously, COVID kind of magnified some of those issues because there were delays that existed. And then the last thing here is obviously electricity, and electricity is going to be the focus of or was a big focus of the report. And I won't steal Veronica's thunder here. So, you know, but the point is that there's big issues. One is reliability of supply, and the second is then on the ability to access renewables. Those 2 points are fundamental to this whole discussion, and we'll get into those, or Veronica will get into those as we go. So just the last slide, you know, and I think that this is the most important one, is that, you know, Mexico is competing on a global level. And if we're talking about much more of the tech sector and specifically semiconductors, this comparison is that we undertook in terms of a SWOT analysis then becomes, you know, quite vital. And I think one of the interesting things that we quickly saw and found out is that for most of the companies that are nearshoring, it's not that the cost is cheaper, right? It's just the proximity market matters a lot, and they're willing to absorb that cost and or pass that cost along to have that proximity to market. Same time zone helps, et cetera. But then the geopolitical uncertainty is a big issue. So, you know, I'm not going to go through all of these items here. Obviously, on the weakness side, I think one item to point out is that, you know, the super peso has had an impact, and not necessarily a good one, on Mexico in terms of its competitiveness. So its labor costs have gone up. They've not gone up as much as China. China's cost very much went up in a very significant way, and that's why you started to see just an ebb and flow outside of China as it was. But, you know, I think that there's pros and cons here, and I think that, you know, the Mexican government as well as industry has got to take a, you know, very close look at some of these aspects very intensely, because it's not just about saying, oh, well, we're neighbors to the United States, or we have access to the Canadian market as well. You're competing globally, and if Mexico really wants to be able to kind of leapfrog and take advantage of this to improve the quality of life of Mexicans and create more economic equality between North and South, et cetera, it has to recognize that these are very big issues that it's going to have to address. Its ability to address these issues will be the ones that will determine how successful nearshoring ultimately becomes, and when we have this conversation perhaps in another decade. And with that, I'll leave my comments there.
Thanks, John. Perfect. And as you said, we will hand it over to Veronica to really get into the electricity, and this was a major aspect of our report. Those factors that came out in the survey, and then some great analysis that Veronica. So, Veronica, over to you, please.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I wanted to start by reminding everyone how important electricity is for manufacturing and for these companies that are looking for this nearshoring opportunity. You know, many industries and processes are becoming even more energy intensive with automation. So they do need, like John mentioned, a reliable and affordable electricity supply, and many of them are also looking for renewables. So this is becoming more of a challenge worldwide, but more so in this context of nearshoring. So we have seen, and I think most of you must be aware, that Mexican President López Obrador has openly pursued the primacy of state control over the energy sector, blocking the development and operation of private energy projects. And this, of course, has had an important impact. And if we can move to the next slide, please. Great. That figure, as you see, shows the generation permits by the Regulatory Commission since 2016. And it is clear that there has been a decline in permitted capacity for private entities, with an increase in the permits for state agencies. And I want to point out that of those permits, only a small fraction is for clean energy or renewable energy. So that represents about 5.5% of the permitted capacity for the state during that period. And many multinationals are committed with the net zero and similar objectives. So therefore, they do need this renewable energy to be able to stay or to grow in Mexico. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Unfortunately, Mexico has lost this attractiveness for energy transition investments because of the issues that I mentioned before, and I think we would need a whole session just to talk about those changes. But according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, in 2023, Mexico was ranked 72 on the list of the most attractive markets for investing in energy transition. And this has been a huge, huge change because it used to be the fourth in 2017. So it was the country that has fallen the most in this ranking, and it's very unfortunate. This chart is from 2022, but the document that just came out a couple of days ago is even worse for Mexico. Can we go to the next one, please? I also wanted to mention that we saw a study by the Chamber of Transformation of Nuevo León that says that almost 70% of the companies that have tried to increase their load, you know, that they would like to consume more energy, are having problems with that. So part of it has to do with Mexico not increasing not only the generation, but also its transmission network. There haven't been any significant investments in years. And just to give you a number, from 2018 to 2022, the transmission network grew less than 2.5% in total, you know, not by year, but in total. So that is really a really small fraction. And from what we can see in this last chart that I want to share with you today, Mexico has already a challenge to have the infrastructure that it needs to grow. And this becomes even more of a challenge with nearshoring. And whichever administration takes office in 2024 has to consider how to support this nearshoring driven economic growth. And in my opinion, collaboration will be essential. There's no way that CFE, the state-owned company, can meet these operational, logistical, and financial requirements on its own. So we'll see what happens next, but I really hope for a change so that Mexico can have the infrastructure that it needs and the renewable energy that the Mexicans need. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. And I think it's the timing of the discussion, and particularly with regard to electricity and the permitting process, and exactly the information and data points on CRE. As we've now had another one of these moments in the last few days where the president makes kinds of statements about getting rid of, disappearing a CRE, right? And I mean, who knows what to ultimately make of that. But again, the point is here, as we're looking at this question of how does Mexico completely realize the opportunity in front of it with regard to nearshoring, right? As John said, it's not a matter of, if and when, it's how much, right? And how much of it can be grasped and actually, the nation sees. So I don't know. Let me ask you directly about
Jeremy,
that.
just to interrupt. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
go ahead.
No, I was gonna say that for me that was very interesting about the survey, and you did mention that, but the electricity is not just about paying a little more, which is already the case for many because CFE rates are usually higher than US rates, but it's a matter of not having access, which is a huge problem. So a barrier more than a cost in terms of the survey.
So in terms of this debate around, maybe it's all noise, but the question of disappearing CRE, well, that's certainly not going to help with reliability and bringing more load and delivering more access to sustainable and reliable sources, right?
Well, no, that would add further uncertainty to private investors, because the regulators are supposed to be like objective, technical, and be able to support these investments, to have clear rules about how the system operates, which without CRE would be impossible.
Right. It's certainly the kind of signal that is not supportive of seizing the opportunity, I would say, right?
Well, let me jump in there, Jeremy, if I could.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think just a reminder to people, this is you have the chance for an open mic here. We set this up so people can have an open mic. So, but go ahead, John.
No, I mean, I think what I would say is that I think the big question on the table, and if we take a look at what's happened in Mexico over this administration, we had an energy reform that tried one direction, and now we've had a administration that has moved in a very different direction. I think you can argue that neither model has quite honestly succeeded for a whole slew of different reasons. Whether you're looking at it from a socio-political perspective, economic perspective, economic growth driven perspective, et cetera. And I think that once again we're at a crossroads. Mexico continues to just secure fantastic opportunities based off of its geographical location, et cetera. And the question is it going to squander it, or is it going to take advantage of it? And so the fundamental question that I think is on the table is basically, does the government have the ability to play that kind of infrastructure role in this kind of environment? And I think the big challenges that you have, whether you're talking about, electricity, whether you're talking about natural gas, et cetera, it's technologically driven. And the problem is that we have in Mexico basically had a long and prolonged history of doing this all through a political lens. And so the decision or the announcement on CRAE, which again, that would require constitutional reform, which right now there's not the votes that are there, but this isn't the first time that we've seen, the president attempt to undertake things that are not that would require constitutional reform, and he doesn't have the constitutional votes for that. But more importantly is that we're taking out the technical elements that will create the stability for whatever model is that moves forward. And if we continue basically extracting those technical elements, then you're just not going to have an environment that is going to be able to take advantage of those elements. Doesn't matter ideologically, which model you're looking at and whether you have the ability to do it or not.
Yeah, which we can get into, maybe we will, the whole, what's the next administration? Because there is going to be, speaking of fundamental questions, how does the next administration look at this topic of seizing nearshoring or advancing with capturing opportunity? But let me go to our old friend, Nick Puga. Nick, it's been a while. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. Well, I'm listening to this conversation, and I guess the 100-pound gorilla or the elephant in the room, to mix metaphors, is what's going to happen with the next administration and whether Morena is going to continue with the Cuarta Transformación. And basically, because John made a very cogent presentation on what the elements that, to be honest, seen through the Morena lens, I hear as neoliberalism at its best. And so I just don't know how much that is going to be allowed to play, or whether the future is that the tremendous advantages of proximity to the United States and delivery, production chains and everything else that he discussed are going to basically be strong enough to force people trying to do nearshoring in Mexico to sort of work around and live with a government that is not in tune with those needs. And so the country is going to continue simply because, we used to have this saying in Mexico, that so far from God and so close to the United States. But if that proximity to the United States is going to be exploited by an administration that is hell-bent in creating a centrally planned economy. And to me, that's going to be I think that's what will happen, but it's going to be suboptimal.
Wait, so you're basically saying you see the next administration and the polling, who knows what polling means anymore, but at least there's a significant gap between the leader, Ms. Sheinbaum, Dr. Sheinbaum, and the next candidate, Xochitl Galvez. So what you're saying is if Sheinbaum wins, you will see the continuation of basically what we've already seen for the last 5.5 years.
Oh, yeah, trying to arm to his people to move to the isthmus without the right infrastructure to develop the southeast and of Mexico. And, it's, I hate to say it, but sort of the Venezuela model, in a way.
Well, don't say that, but all right, Veronica. Yeah, I'm not feeling so hot as you probably can hear, so we don't need to do that to me, Nick. Yeah, Veronica, react. Okay, and actually, let me ask John McNeese, because we can spend the rest of the discussion this morning on sort of what will and how the next administration manage the nearshoring opportunity, whether that's Sheinbaum or Galvez. But let's go to John and get his comment in question. And he's somebody who has looked very deeply, by the way, at the CHIPS Act and just actually what that means on some of these topics. So John, over to you.
Well, I mean, I think the starting point
No, I'm
is
sorry. I'm
that,
sorry. John McNeese. I'm sorry. My bad. My
sorry,
bad.
sorry, sorry.
Ah,
Go ahead.
my fault. Sorry. I see. I'm looking at the hand up on the screen here. Sorry. John McNeese. Yeah.
First, I wanted to say that this is a really good study. I think that the data on how the potential investors are looking at Mexico is very useful. And that particular point on the costs of regulatory compliance is something I had not focused on before. So that's very good. I want to highlight the point that John Padilla made, that for existing supply chains, there is a fair amount of momentum, and it's going to move and it's going to grow on its own. This area of new investment, which John Padilla highlighted as critical for the future, is very tricky. And the point I wanted to make, and some research I've done that Jeremy was referring to, is that, you know, Biden's economic policy, industrial policy, is very US centric. It's trying to pull manufacturing into the US. It's trying to pull jobs into the US. It does have a component not as well articulated, not as well funded for North American supply chains. But a key question going forward is, can the Mexican government take advantage of those opportunities that are available under the Biden economic policy? And this is run through the high-level economic dialogue. And I don't see enough being done. The things that you're talking about with building energy infrastructure, building the other infrastructure that's needed is all very important and critical. But I see the need for the Mexican government to engage more with the US to take advantage of those opportunities that are available under the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so that's the point I want to make. The future and the new supply chains are what's critical. As John Padilla points out, Mexico can and should do a lot more to deal with this US-centric industrial policy that Biden has put together. Thank you.
No, thanks, John. And it's an excellent point, because even though, as you rightly note, the Biden and all of these major pieces of legislation have come about the last couple of years are inbound, domestically oriented, there are opportunities, and Mexico is fairly unique given sort of the USMCA and free trade agreement. Okay, John Padilla wanted to weigh in, and we'll ask Veronica as well, and then David, I think we'll have a question or comment, and we have a poll for you guys because we want to ask you more or less the same question as we asked the executives. John Padilla, I'll use last names now.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, my bad.
No, So listen, I think the starting point, I wanted to go back to Nick's comments, which is that I think, Mexico right now, there's certainly, there's a fair amount of, what should I say, lack of contentment, given, rising costs. I mean, anybody that's been to Mexico City will appreciate that extremely well. But it's across the board. Healthcare. There's a lot of issues. But from the macro perspective, you have a peso that is continued to remain healthy, and so there's this perception. I would categorize it as everything's okay. But I think that, again, from my financial background, there was a huge runway that López Obrador had when he came to office that has narrowed tremendously here over the last 5 years. And so whatever administration comes next is not going to have the same kind of leeway economically, financially, nor is it going to have the same kind of leeway politically. And those two components combined are going to have a tremendous impact on the kind of ultimate decisions that are taken. So right now, what we're basically left with is we have kind of one viewpoint that is that a centralized kind of state model is the one that can go ahead and do this. And they point to Puerto Peñasco. Don't ask about the the cost of what that's going to run and the impact that it's going to have on the government, et cetera. But that's the model that's out there, right? And so we only have a few little relief valves through distributed generation, 500 kilowatts. There's a new proposal that has just come out to take that up to 1 megawatt, but there's a lot of nuances that matter quite a bit. But it's still not enough to help industry achieve and solve what it is that they need to do. So self-supply, fine, but then you need grid connection, you need transmission. So what has happened under this administration? It's basically, well, you pay for it. Basically, you group of companies, and then but all that's doing is deferring the cost, right? And so again, I think the fundamental question is if that is the model that is pursued under the next administration, because right now Claudia Sheinbaum is ahead in polls, and that's what most people are looking at, is will they be able to continue to pursue that policy? And what I think the bright spot here is that if you look in detail at the incentive plan that Hacienda has put forward for the first time, okay, this is something that you've not seen in Latin America. This is something that provides tax benefit and will start attracting investment. Well, if that's happening, that's saying we care about nearshoring, and then we're going to have to resolve these issues. So I think that given those two dynamics, it leads to a fairly optimistic result, which is to say, it may be ugly in the middle, it may be ugly in the early term, but the reality is that if those are the objectives, if those are the goals, we're going to have to figure out how to get there. And the only way is going to be to create regulatory certainty, address all of those kind of challenges that I tried to lay out, and take advantage of it, because that's the only thing that's going to really move the needle.
The points of fiscal terms or the fiscal incentives is huge. Veronica, there's a host of things that you can weigh in on, so I'll just pass the mic to you.
No, I'll be really brief because I know that we
please.
don't have a lot of time and we have a couple of times. But I just wanted to mention from what Nick said, I think that López Obrador had somehow like a cushion in the energy sector investments, because with the reform, a lot of companies came to Mexico and they started investing, like the winners of the long-term auctions, for example, got built during this term. So he saw this capacity come online. And now I think the problem is going to be much bigger for the next administration, where we are already seeing a lot of challenges with electricity. Like if we see more outages and more challenges, they will have to do something. And if they continue with the current policy, I think it's going to be a problem. And for me, the main problem is the lack of transparency in everything. Like even with the permits that I showed, we don't really know how some private get permits and others don't. Like there's no clear criteria. Like in fact, some of these projects that we see have somehow a relationship with Pemex or CFE. It's like a generator that is going to be built for these oil fields or something, but there's no clear criteria. So I think that's a problem. And the second problem, which is related, is not only state-centered, but there's also this lack of transparency that creates a problem. Like who is building the infrastructure now? There's no like public solicitation processes. We don't know why this project, why this company, and I think that has to change to be attractive for investors. And so if they do want to continue with a state-centered sector, they would have to create the current like regulatory framework and etc. for this to be done in a better way that is attractive to investors as well.
No, thank you, Veronica. It's such an important point, like you mentioned, of that, the graphic you shared and the research you did that was also in the report about who gets permitted, why, how, let alone what strategic decisions are being made about projects. And then, like you said, I mean, the long-term auction process that was put in place, which, by the way, the auctions, have been an amazing tool used all over the world, to really drive competitive, pricing, and like you said, very, very transparent kinds of bid rounds and in delivery of power solutions. So let's see what happens. I mean, maybe one of the things we could hope for is that those kinds of tools, even if they're state centered or state led, in the hands of CFE or in the case of some other, PEMEX, then nevertheless, there's still auction processes that can be, understood as transparent on their face. But I want to have David. He's had his hand up patiently. Thanks, David.
Hey, fascinating program, fascinating discussion all the way here. So one comment regarding election uncertainty. We have our own uncertainties here in the United States. It's not clear at all who's going to be president in 2024, what party is going to control in Congress, and what will happen with the IRA. So maybe, in fact, the geopolitical issue, which both parties seem to buy into pretty strongly in the U.S., might be the ultimate driving factor for Mexico for nearshoring investment. My question really is for Veronica, and John, if you got a comment on it. So Veronica, you were talking about growing power demand in Mexico, not just outages, but just raw growth in power demand. Is there enough transmission capacity to handle significant investments in renewables? Question.
No, for sure that has been a problem already, where we have seen curtailments with existing capacity. And as I was mentioning, there haven't been any significant investments in transmission. So 2.5% growth in like 5 years or something like that. So no, that really is an area of opportunity, and this is something that is state-owned. So there's no question that is something for the next administration to do. And the transmission company, the state-owned CFE, has had like resources. They do have money to start with these investments and several ways to finance them as well. So I think that's a no-brainer for the next administration.
Got it. Thank you.
To build out. So yeah, I mean, to build out the basically CFE to build transmission infrastructure, and like John mentioned also about sort of the redundancy question, because I think part of the reliability issue has to do with just the lack of the networks, and the interconnection. I mean, for example, right here in Baja California, you're not connected to the main Mexican grid, and that's been something heavily debated for years, but just never seems to get solved.
What about permitting for like rooftop systems? I hate to mention the word, green laundering, greenwashing and all, but, even these, large scale global manufacturers, if they can get some photos of some rooftops in Mexico, because I can see this being a real handicap for not just American manufacturing headed to the United States, but to Europe.
Right. No, that's, and then as Europe puts in the carbon border adjustment tax, and there is, John mentioned about the, Veronica, if you want to comment about the distributed generation, current regulation is only allowing self-supply at what, 500 kV, and so, but there's Veronica, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that it goes back to what you were saying before. I think that even with distributed generation, you do still need the transmission, so there's no way around it.
Yeah, to move large scale the load. Yeah. All right, we'll have the results of the poll. John, Padilla, jump in here, and then we'll wrap this thing up. If there's any last questions, please let us know. John, Padilla.
Yeah. So just on the issue of transmission, quick comment there is that, I mean, this is where the austerity of this administration, seen through the political lens, has really had just such a tremendous impact, because it's cut maintenance. You've seen that in the subway system. You've seen it in Pemex with all the accidents, and you've seen it here on CFE with the transmission lines, et cetera. So again, this this aptitude to consistently do everything through a political lens is highly problematic. And I mean, I think just I wanted to go back to and follow up and build off of what Veronica was saying in terms of investment. And so what we've seen to date with Pemex and CFE and these investments that Veronica was making reference to is that they've been done with projects that have sufficient size and scale and return. That's the reality. Okay. The problem that you have with electricity is that you don't have those kind of returns. So you have seen recently permits for basically generation projects, both for New Fortress Energy as well as Mexico Pacific. But again, this is, if we continue to have a one-off type of permitting process, it's just not, you can't do that size and scale for nearshoring, and it's not going to work on the electricity side. So that model just, it's hit a wall, and you're going to have something that's completely different.
Yeah, I guess in summary, it's not strategic at all, and it's not being strategic about capturing the nearshoring opportunity. It's being sort of having projects that are the leaders convinced of being good projects or whatever the case may be. So we have the results here. I don't know if we have biased as the presentation and the presenters in our report. We may have biased the results of the audience survey today. And what I mean by that is we have a whopping 70% of you all indicating as the sort of barrier or the complexity factor that's most important for nearshoring investment in Mexico is electricity. I think we agree on a certain level, particularly when we talked about the cost elements and how security, as John discussed, it sort of gets baked in, or it gets managed, socialized across. But this issue of, if you don't have electricity, you don't have reliable, and more importantly, more renewable clean energy in the coming years, as supply chains around the world are demanding and requiring, it just, it could be this major inhibiting factor. Permitting and security tied for, I guess, second here. But Veronica, any final thoughts on that, or overall?
No, not really, John. Thank you.
Nick Puga wants us to bring up COP28, but it's 9:59, so we'll say that everything's a transitional fuel. How about that, Nick? That's my takeaway of the communique, is that we have this new transitional fuel. That's our new terminology for things. John, final thoughts?
No, I mean, I was actually going to bring up, COP28, and I mean, it's just the momentum, whether it's how it's going to unfold. There's going to be a lot more money that's coming, towards clean energy, irrespectively. And, I think that the focus really needs to be, there's a lot of lobbying effort going on right now with the different administrations. And instead of talking about projects, I think it's talk about money. Right now, we're kind of walking in this little euphoric world right now, and the reality is that the bandwidth is shrunk very significantly. That's going to decide the outcome, and then the questions are you going to take advantage of it, and if so, what are you going to do to make sure that happens?
We'll leave it right there. That's the perfect place to end it. Diana Rodriguez, thank you for all your help manning the polling and the slides. And thanks everyone for joining us this morning. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that good stuff. Thanks for joining us with the year-end crunch. We appreciate it. And we'll be in touch again soon. This is absolutely not going to go away as a major topic. And just as a way of indication of the importance, the Institute is very much involved, particularly in the Cali Baja region, with regards to a lot of these issues as well. And so stay tuned for some more on that in the coming year. So have a wonderful holiday season. Take care.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.